Lake Ontario stretched flat and black beneath a sky that had forgotten the color of warmth. A rusted pickup truck sat alone in an empty church parking lot, settling across the hood like a burial cloth. No lights on inside, no movement. Just the fog of a single breath pressing against the cracked windshield. Inside, a woman who had survived 2 wars and one slow collapse sat in the dark holding a letter she had already read 6 times. The letter said her father was dead. It said there was a will. What the letter did not say, what no one in that wood-paneled law office would bother to say, was that the thing they were about to hand her in that room, the thing they would give her with a laugh already waiting behind their eyes, was not a punishment. It was a key. And somewhere in a rotting house at the edge of the lake, behind a sealed wall that an old dog would find before any human thought to look, a dead man's secret had been waiting a very long time for exactly the wrong person to walk through the door. Lake Ontario lay under a hard winter sky, its dark water breathing cold mist across the empty church parking lot where Letha Hartwick had slept for the 11th night in a row. The lot was quiet before sunrise, the kind of quiet that belongs to places that have stopped expecting anyone. Snow had settled on the hood of her truck overnight, and the windshield wore a skin of ice that turned the parking lot lights into soft, shapeless smears. Letha woke before dawn the way soldiers wake, not slowly, not gently, but all at once, her body registering the cold before her mind registered where she was. Her right shoulder had gone stiff again. Her knees ached with the particular complaint of joints that had been asked to perform too much for too many years. She pulled in a breath and watched it fog against the cracked glass. She was 48 years old. Hardship had carved another decade into her face, or so she had been told by the last doctor who saw her, a volunteer at a free clinic who had the kind eyes of a man who had learned to deliver hard news gently. Her hair, once dark brown, had thinned at the temples and turned the color of old ash around her ears. Her jaw was strong, her cheekbones sharpened by hunger into something that might have looked sculptural under different circumstances. Under these circumstances, it just looked like what it was, a woman who had not eaten enough for a long time. Beneath an old army coat, her body remained broad and capable. Years of military discipline had built something durable in her, and even poverty had not entirely undone it. But the hollows beneath her eyes told the truer story. Those were the hollows of someone who had stopped expecting rest to feel like rest. On the passenger seat beside her, a weight shifted and resettled. Buddy lifted his head from the folded blanket he had claimed as his own and looked at Letha with amber eyes that held the particular steadiness of old dogs and old soldiers. He was 8 years old, black and tan, with a silver muzzle that had come in early and a dark saddle of fur across his back that had never faded. His left ear stood straight. His right ear had been torn in some forgotten dispute before she found him and had never stood quite right since. Letha had found Buddy 2 years earlier at a rescue shelter scheduled to close within the week. She had gone in looking for nothing in particular, which was the only kind of looking she could afford. Most of the dogs came to the front of their kennels when she walked through. Buddy had been sitting in the farthest one, back against the wall, watching her without urgency, without performance. He had the look of an animal that had been passed over enough times to stop campaigning. She recognized that look. She had seen it in mirrors. She had spent her last $40 adopting him that afternoon. For the 3 days following, she ate crackers and drank gas station coffee so he could have proper food. It had not felt like a sacrifice. It had felt like the first sensible decision she had made in years. Since then, Buddy had slept between Letha and every cold doorway, every unpredictable stranger, every night that stretched too long. He did not ask her to explain herself. He did not require her to be well. He only required her presence, and she required his, and that arrangement had kept something essential alive in both of them through the kind of winter that breaks people who face it alone. Letha rubbed the back of his neck and felt him lean into her hand. She had served 2 tours before the thing in her chest stopped fitting neatly inside the uniform. She did not talk about the tours. The memories were not organized in ways that translated well into conversation. They sat inside her as a kind of weight that distributed itself unevenly, heavier on some days than others, and she had learned to carry it the same way she had learned to carry everything, by not setting it down and not looking at it directly. Her father, Corbett Hartwick, had been the one person who had come close to understanding that. He was a broad-shouldered man who worked with wood the way some people work with language, finding the right grain, the right angle, the right pressure. He had pale blue eyes and the habit of speaking quietly even when he was angry, which Letha had always found more unnerving than shouting. He loved old things that still had use in them. Worn tools, weathered lumber, broken friendships that could still be repaired with enough patience and the right words. After Letha came home changed, Corbett had been the one who did not immediately try to fix her. He had simply been there, or tried to be. But then he got sick. And Willa Blaine, Corbett's second wife, began constructing walls the way some people construct walls, quietly, systematically, one brick at a time, until you look up one day and realize you can no longer see over them. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits became exercises in discomfort. Work disappeared. The rent on her apartment rose past what she could cover. Shame accumulated the way snow accumulates, not dramatically, but steadily, until one morning she woke up in her truck and understood that the word temporary no longer applied. She had been sleeping in the truck for 4 months when the letter arrived through the shelter mail program. She reached across Buddy and opened the glove box. Inside, a flashlight with batteries that were losing their argument against entropy, a photograph of Corbett holding a fishing rod on some summer dock she could not place, and an envelope from the offices of Hartwick and Colwell, attorneys at law. She had read the letter 6 times. Each reading made her feel less like a daughter and more like an old debt someone had finally remembered to collect. Corbett Hartwick was dead. The reading of the will would take place at 10 that morning. Letha sat for a moment with the letter in her hands. The parking lot was still empty. The mist off the lake moved through the lot in slow drifts. Buddy watched her face the way dogs watch faces, reading something she could not read herself. She had no suit. She had a faded flannel shirt, dark jeans worn white at both knees, and a pair of brown work boots whose leather had cracked along the left toe. She had Buddy. That was the full inventory. She folded the letter along its existing creases and put it back. The law offices of Hartwick and Colwell stood on Main Street between a bank and a florist. The bank had a clean stone facade. The florist had winter arrangements in the window. The law office had glass polished so clear that Letha saw her own reflection before she reached the door and stopped for a moment without meaning to. She looked like someone a storm had misplaced. Inside, the carpet was the color of old money. The air held a faint smell of lemon polish and climate control. Framed certificates covered the walls in careful rows. A receptionist with the practiced expression of someone trained to show nothing looked up, assessed Letha and Buddy in less than a second, and directed them down a short hallway with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste sympathy. The senior partner rose from behind a mahogany desk when they entered. He was a thin man in his late 60s, silver hair combed flat against his skull, narrow shoulders that had never quite filled out a suit jacket, and cautious gray eyes that had learned to hide whatever he actually felt behind the vocabulary of professional neutrality. His handshake was brief, not unkind. He looked at Buddy. "The dog may remain if it stays calm," he said. Buddy, who found the suggestion mildly offensive, sat down beside Letha's chair with the posture of a creature that has never required instruction on how to behave. Across the room, Willa Blaine sat in a chair angled precisely away from where Letha would sit. She was 62, tall and slender, with white blonde hair cut just below the chin in a style that looked effortless and cost a great deal. Her skin was smooth in the way that money and attention can keep skin smooth. Her eyes were a pale blue that had been drained of warmth through long and deliberate practice. She wore a cream wool coat with gold buttons. She did not acknowledge Letha's entry. She acknowledged nothing that was not worth acknowledging, and Letha had not qualified for that category in some years. Beside her sat Whit Blaine, 39 years old, Corbett's stepson, Willa's son from a previous marriage. He had dark hair and the kind of looks that photograph well, clean jaw, easy smile, features arranged in a configuration that read as confidence from a distance and something closer to calculation up close. He wore a tailored navy coat that communicated, without stating, that he was accustomed to rooms like this one. He was the kind of man who wore his belonging like a second suit. When Letha settled into her chair, Whit looked at her. He raised 2 fingers from his knee in a loose, minimal wave, the kind that manages to be technically a greeting while communicating clearly that it costs nothing. "Rough commute from the parking lot?" he said. His voice was easy, almost gentle. The softness of it was the point. It let him land the blow and then stand back while it registered. But he made a sound low in his chest. Not a growl exactly, something older than a growl, a sound that lived in the frequency of warnings. Letha put a hand on the back of his neck and said nothing. The senior partner opened a folder and began reading in the measured cadence of a man who had read a great many wills. and knew that the distance between professional and personal was a matter of pace. The large house in town went to Willa. The family accounts, investment holdings, and Corbett's shares in his development partnership went into a trust administered jointly by Willa and Witt. Several valuable lots near the lakefront were transferred to Witt's name outright. Letha listened without moving. She had not come expecting wealth. She was aware that expecting things was a habit she had mostly broken over the past several years. But something small and foolish and apparently unkillable inside her had hoped for a sign, a watch, a letter, a fishing rod from a summer dawn. Something that said, "I saw you. I remembered you. You were still mine." The senior partner cleared his throat. "To my daughter, Letha Hartwick," he read, "I leave the property known as Blue Heron House, located on the Northern Shore Road outside Fairhaven, including the surrounding wooded parcel and all structures upon it." The room went still in the particular way. Rooms go still when something inevitable has finally arrived. Willa's mouth moved. It did not form a smile. It formed something thinner, something with calculation behind it. "That property's been condemned in spirit if not on paper," she said. "Corbett kept it for sentimental reasons. It leaks, it rots. It costs more in taxes each year than it will ever be worth to anyone." Witt leaned back slightly in his chair, a posture of ease that required effort to maintain. "Honestly, Letha, it may be the first property that actually suits you. No furniture to ruin, no neighbors to bother, plenty of room for the dog." Buddy's ears lifted, his lips pulled back by a fraction. The sound that came from him this time was quiet and very old, like a door shifting on a hinge that had been still for a long time. Letha kept her hand on his collar. The humiliation moved through her the way cold water moves into a boot. Slowly at first, then all at once, she felt the walls of the office lean closer. She felt Corbett's absence the way you feel an empty chair no one will acknowledge. The senior partner slid a yellow deed across the desk. The paper stopped before her hands and sat there, Blue Heron House. The name surfaced from somewhere she had not visited in years, a weathered lake house among pine trees, her father's laugh carrying across water, the smell of Seacher smoke, a blue heron lifting from the reeds like something that had decided gravity was optional. Then Willa's voice cut through the memory like a window being shut. "Take it, Letha. It is more generous than you deserve from a man whose phone calls you stopped returning." Something inside Letha flinched at that. It did not break. Perhaps it was too tired to break. Perhaps Buddy's warmth against her leg held the pieces in a configuration that would otherwise have come apart. She picked up the deed. Her fingers were rough, the nails dark with the particular grime that accumulates under the conditions of outdoor living. The paper did not care. It rested in her hands, light as a feather and heavy as everything. She stood. Her boots made a small sound on the expensive carpet. She looked at Willa. She looked at Witt. In both faces, she found no grief for Corbett, only the satisfaction of people who have organized another person's belongings to their advantage. She thought of everything she might say. She thought of her years in uniform, of the things she had done and survived and carried home. She thought of the parking lot, and the crackers she ate so Buddy could have proper food, and the 100 ways she had been made to feel like a problem someone had failed to solve. The words gathered behind her teeth and stayed there. Some battles are not dignified by the speeches they deserve. She folded the deed once and put it inside her coat. Buddy stood when she stood. He moved beside her with his muzzle raised and his body close to her knee, steady as a compass needle. As they walked out through the carpeted hallway and past the receptionist with her practiced expression, Witt said something else behind them. Letha did not hear the exact words. She heard only the tone, the easy amusement of someone who has already gotten what he came for. The cold outside was immediate and honest. It struck her face without apology. For Willa and Witt, Blue Heron House was a joke dressed up in legal paper. For Letha Hartwick, it was the first address anyone had given her in 4 years. She walked back to her truck with Buddy beside her, and beneath the grief and the shame, something she had not felt in a long time had begun to take shape inside her chest. She could not name it yet. She only knew it burned. Rain followed Letha all the way north. It came down against the windshield in the steady, purposeful way of rain that intends to stay a while. The road narrowed as she left the town behind, the asphalt thinning to 2 lanes, then to a surface that seemed more suggestion than road, the gravel soft from recent thaw, the pine trees on either side standing close and dark and indifferent. Buddy sat in the passenger seat with his silver muzzle lifted toward the seam of the window she had cracked half an inch. His amber eyes moved through the trees as she drove, tracking something she could not see. He had a quality in unfamiliar places of attention that went deeper than curiosity, as if he were listening to frequencies that did not require ears. She had told herself not to expect much. She was practiced at that. The house appeared through the rain like a vessel that had run aground among black trees and simply stayed where it stopped. Its cedar siding had gone dark with years of moisture and neglect, the grain eaten away in long channels by water that had found its way in and stayed. The porch had collapsed on the left side entirely. One corner dropped at an angle that suggested a slow surrender rather than a sudden one. Several windows were cracked, others covered with plywood that had warped and lifted at the corners. Voss had claimed the north wall in green and gray patches from the ground to the eaves. A gutter had separated from the fascia and hung at an angle, draining steadily onto the broken porch steps in a thin, persistent stream. Behind the house, visible through the tree line, Lake Ontario lay flat and gray under the rain, its far edge dissolved into mist. Letha sat in the parked truck for a long moment without moving. She had known it would be bad. Knowing and seeing are different countries, and seeing made Willa's insult heavier than it had felt in the law office, more deliberate, more specifically cruel. Buddy nudged her arm with his nose, not urgently. Just a reminder that the truck was not where they were going. She got out into the rain. Inside, Blue Heron House smelled of mildew and old ash, and something else she would later identify as time itself, the specific odor of a building that has been left alone long enough to begin a conversation with decay. The floorboards spoke under her weight. Somewhere deep in the walls, the sound of small claws retreating. The living room contained a stone fireplace, a canvas chair with a long tier along one arm, a bookshelf warped into a gentle curve, and a rug that had absorbed so much moisture it had begun to look geological. She found 3 leaks in the ceiling and positioned her 2 dented cooking pots beneath the worst of them. When a mouse crossed the hallway at a brisk diagonal, Buddy watched it pass with the expression of a retired official who no longer concerns himself with minor violations. "I suppose we have roommates," Letha said. Her voice sounded strange in the empty house. It had nowhere to go except back. She unloaded what she had brought, a sleeping bag, 2 cans of beans, half a loaf of bread from the church pantry, a small camping stove, and Buddy's food and water bowl. She fed him first, as she always did. Then she sat on the floor beside the dead fireplace and ate cold beans from the can while the rain moved over the roof and found the places it had always found. The next several days shaped themselves into a pattern of attrition and small victories. Mornings she worked on the house. She patched the worst of the roof damage with a blue tarp, pulling it tight across the damaged section and nailing the edges with the few nails she could afford. She knocked broken glass from window frames and covered the openings with flattened cardboard weighted with scrap wood. She dragged the rotted carpet out through the front door in heavy, dripping sections, leaving the bare boards to dry in the cold air. Afternoons, she went into Fairhaven for work. There was usually something. She stacked firewood behind a diner on the south end of town for a man who paid cash without conversation, which she appreciated. She unloaded delivery crates at the grocery before the store opened. She cleaned a gutter for a church that paid her in a bag of groceries and a polite refusal to ask about her circumstances. She carried feed sacks at a farm outside of town for an older man named Dell, whose hip had given out in November and who watched her work with the concentrated attention of someone who has learned to evaluate people by how they live. Each evening she walked back to Blue Heron House with raw hands and a body that ached in specific, accountable places. Buddy walked beside her every step of the way, never ranging ahead, never falling behind. He had adopted, as his primary occupation, the role of keeping her from disappearing entirely into the landscape of her own exhaustion. He was very good at it. On the 5th morning, she walked into Thorn Hardware on the south end of Main Street, drawn by a sign in the window advertising roofing supplies. The shop smelled of sawdust and machine oil and coffee that had been burning on its burner long enough to develop its own opinions. Behind the counter stood a man she had not seen before. Orville Thorne was somewhere in his mid-60s, built in the manner of a man who had spent his working life actually working. Wide through the shoulders, heavy through the forearms, with a gray beard that looked less like a style choice and more like a condition that had simply arrived and stayed. His flannel shirt had been washed enough times to achieve a kind of softness that could not be purchased. He wore suspenders, not as an affectation, but because he had always worn suspenders. His eyes were the color of weathered wood, and they held the particular quality of someone who had seen enough human difficulty to have developed a considered position on it. He looked at Letha the way experienced people look at new arrivals, fully, without performance. Then he looked at Buddy. "Corbett Hartwick's girl," he said. "Not a question." Letha felt the muscles in her shoulders tighten, preparing for what usually came next. The pity, the lowered voice, the careful language of people who feel obligated to say something kind about the dead. She had endured a great deal of that kind of language in the past several days. It was well-intentioned, and it exhausted her. Orville did not do any of that. He reached under the counter and brought up a small box of roofing nails, a roll of tar paper, and an old brass oil lamp whose glass chimney was intact. He set them on the counter in a line. "Put it on account," he said. Letha looked at the items, then at him. "I don't have an account here." The corner of his mouth moved. "You do now." He said nothing else for a moment. His hands rested on the counter, unhurried. Then, without preamble, without the buildup of someone who is about to tell you something important, he said, "Your father loved that lake house." Talked about it the way some people talk about a church, like it was made of something that didn't have a name. He paused. There were things he never got to finish saying. Letha stood at the counter of that hardware store with the box of nails and the roll of tar paper and the brass lamp in front of her, and she felt something shift inside her that she could not account for. Not grief exactly, though grief was in it. More like the feeling of a door opening onto a room you didn't know was in the building. She thanked him. She paid for what she could pay for and took what he had offered and walked back out into the cold. His words came with her. She carried them the way you carry something fragile, carefully, without looking at it directly, because you are not yet sure it will survive being examined. That evening, after hours of nailing and sweeping and dragging, Letha knelt in front of the stone fireplace and worked at building a fire for the first time. The wood she had gathered from the property was damp at the surface but dry inside, and it took 4 attempts before the kindling caught and held. The smoke pushed back at first, filling the lower portion of the room and making her eyes water, before the draft in the old chimney remembered its function and drew the smoke upward. The fire settled into a low, steady burn. The light it gave was narrow and gold, advancing against the dark by inches rather than feet, but it advanced. Buddy stretched himself out on the floor before the hearth, his entire body releasing the tension of the cold in a long, visible exhalation. He lay with his chin on his front paws, and the firelight caught his silver muzzle and made him look like something painted rather than real. Letha sat with her back against the wall, the sleeping bag pulled over her legs. She listened to the rain tapping the windows in an irregular rhythm, to the lake wind moving through the gaps in the siding, to the occasional deep sound of the house settling around her. For the first time in a long time, no one could come to this window, to this parking lot, and ask her to move along. The thought arrived in her chest not as relief, but as something more complicated, the recognition that having a place means having something to lose. She was still sitting with that thought when Buddy's head came up from the floor. The movement was sharp and specific, not the gradual alertness of a dog that has heard something ordinary. His ears moved forward and held there. His body stiffened across the hindquarters while his front remained still, a posture Letha recognized from other contexts. The readiness of something that has identified a signal and is deciding what it means. He rose, fully, carefully. His torn right ear bent in its characteristic lean while his good left ear tracked independently. He turned away from the fire and faced the wall to the left of the stone fireplace. Nothing moved in that wall. No scratching, no skittering of claws, no wind finding a new path through the gaps. The plaster and the cedar paneling were still and dark and ordinary. Buddy walked toward the wall. His nose dropped to the baseboard, tracking along it in a slow line, and then he stopped. His lips pulled back from his teeth by the smallest degree. The sound that came from him then was not loud. It was controlled, precise, the sound of an animal communicating certainty rather than alarm. A low, sustained growl that filled the room without bouncing off the walls, that seemed to sink into the floor instead. Letha found the flashlight and crossed the room. She moved the beam across the paneling, across the nail heads, across the mortar between the fireplace stones. In the narrow gap between the wall and the stonework, a shadow that might have been a seam or might have been something else. Buddy pressed his nose almost to the wood. Then he pulled back 2 inches and barked once. The sound struck the walls of Blue Heron House like a hammer striking a sealed door, and in the silence that followed, Letha stood very still with the flashlight in her hand and felt the house listen back. He was not reacting to a mouse. She had seen him react to mice. He registered them with a brief, disinterested attention and moved on. This was different. This was the stillness she had seen in him before, the specific quality of alertness that meant he had identified something that required human attention. She had seen it overseas in animals that worked alongside patrols, the particular posture of a creature whose senses had arrived at a conclusion that the humans around it had not yet reached. He stood with his muzzle pointed at the wall, his torn ear crooking forward, and he did not move. Letha put her hand on the paneling and pressed. The wood was cold and faintly damp at the surface. It did not flex, it did not sound hollow. She moved her hand 6 inches to the left and pressed again. This time the wood gave slightly, a fraction of give that should not have been there against the solid mass of the fireplace stonework. She pressed harder. The paneling returned a sound that was not the sound of plaster and stone behind it. It was the sound of space. In the 3 nights that followed, Buddy refused to sleep anywhere except beside that wall. He would eat, he would accept water, he would follow Letha from room to room as she worked. But when night came and Letha settled into her sleeping bag, he returned to his position against the cedar paneling and stayed there, silver muzzle pointed at the wood, unmoving, patient, in the way of a creature that understands waiting in a way that most people have forgotten. Letha tried all of the ordinary explanations and discarded them. None of them accounted for the specific quality of Buddy's attention, which was not the attention of an animal responding to something random. It was the attention of an animal that had found something and was waiting for the slow human beside him to understand what that meant. On the 4th evening, Letha came back from Fairhaven with a crowbar Orville had lent her without being asked. The snow that had been threatening for 2 days had finally arrived, and it clung to her boots and coat in wet patches that melted when she stepped inside. She fed Buddy first. Then she knelt on the floor beside the fireplace, the flashlight between her teeth, and said quietly to the dog sitting 3 feet away and watching her with absolute concentration, "All right, boy, let's find out what's been calling you." The first board came loose with a crack that sounded too loud in the empty room. Cold air moved outward from the gap, carrying a smell that was not mildew and not rot and not anything she could name from the ordinary vocabulary of old houses. It was the smell of paper and leather and something metallic, and beneath all of that, the specific scent of a space that had been sealed against time and had succeeded. Buddy took 1 step forward, his muzzle dropped toward the opening. Letha pulled out the ruined insulation and reached deeper with the crowbar. The space behind the paneling ran back nearly 3 feet, hidden by the thick stonework of the fireplace on one side and the outer wall on the other. She widened the gap until her arms burned. When the inner board cracked and gave way, the cold air that came out carried all of that smell at once, stronger now, unmistakable. She pointed the flashlight into the space. Inside, a canvas bundle tied with cotton cord that had gone brittle. A black iron box with a hasp but no padlock. A leather notebook swollen at the spine from moisture that had found its way in at some point and then dried. Several photographs, their edges curled inward. And a flat package wrapped in oilcloth and tied with waxed twine. Buddy barked once, hard and clean, the way you ring a bell to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else. Letha reached inside. She took the photographs first. The one on top showed a man she knew, her father, Corbett Hartwick, younger by 15 years or more, standing in front of Blue Heron House on a summer afternoon. He was wearing work clothes with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the sun had done what summer sun does to a man who works outdoors. Around him stood several older men in worn coats, their posture carrying the particular weight of people who have spent time in places that leave marks. Behind them, above the porch of the house that Willa had called worthless, hung a hand-painted wooden sign, Harbor House. No veteran sleeps alone. Letha had never heard that name. She had never seen that sign. She stood in the broken living room of her inheritance with her father's photograph in her hands and looked at the words above the porch, and something in her chest rearranged itself around a new understanding. The leather notebook opened with a sound like a dry whisper from another century. Corbett Hartwick had pressed hard when he wrote, and his pen had left faint impressions in the pages beneath each line, so that even the blank spaces between his words carried a kind of shadow. The handwriting was firm at the beginning, each letter placed with the care of a man who believed that how you set a thing down mattered as much as what you were setting down. Letha sat on the floor of Blue Heron House with her back against the cold stone of the fireplace and read her father's words for the first time. He had not been building a vacation property. He had never intended Blue Heron House as a retreat or an investment or a tax burden or any of the other things Willa had described in the law office with that particular thinness of expression that passed for amusement. He had been building something he called Harbor House, and he had been building it quietly, in the spaces that Willa did not monitor, with the patience of a man who understood that certain things must be constructed in secret to survive long enough to be used. The plan was specific. Not a dream written down in the way people write dreams, with soft edges and no accounting for logistics. This was a carpenter's plan. Materials, sequence, problems anticipated, solutions proposed, warm beds, 3 meals a day prepared in a real kitchen, legal assistance for men whose discharge paperwork had been lost or whose benefits had been denied through bureaucratic attrition, a place where a veteran could arrive without an appointment and without being required to explain himself before being offered something to eat. Corbett had written, "The question is never what they did. The question is only what they need tonight." Letha read that line twice, then she kept going. The notebook described men Corbett had already helped before the house was ready, quietly, through his own resources. A man named Thomas, who had been sleeping behind the bus station on Keller Street for 11 months. A man who had not spoken to his daughter in 7 years, and who had agreed, over a cup of coffee at Corbett's kitchen table, to make one phone call. A man who wept when Corbett handed him a blanket that had been washed and folded, because the softness of it reminded him of something he had stopped letting himself remember. Corbett had written their stories without sentimentality. He recorded what they had needed and what had been provided and what had happened after, in the same matter-of-fact register he would have used to document the progress of a renovation. This wall reinforced, this window replaced, this man sleeping indoors for the first time in 2 years. Then the notebook changed. Letha felt it before she fully processed the words, felt it in the rhythm of the writing itself, which became less regular, the letters less evenly spaced, as if the hand producing them was working against some kind of interference. The tone shifted from documentation to something more careful, more guarded. Corbett wrote about money going missing from an account he had established specifically for Harbor House. Not a dramatic disappearance, not a single large withdrawal, the kind of missing that looks at first like accounting error, that takes months to identify as something deliberate. He described finding a signature on a transfer document that looked like his signature from a distance and was wrong in ways that required close attention to detect. He described a folder of legal papers that had been on his desk on a Tuesday and was not there on Wednesday and was never mentioned by anyone in the house. Willa's name appeared first, then Witt's. Corbett had written, "I am not certain. I want to be wrong, but I have built enough to know when a load-bearing wall has been tampered with." He believed they had drained the Harbor House account across 18 months while he was ill, moving money in small enough increments to avoid drawing attention. He believed they had made contact with a resort developer who wanted the lakefront parcel and who was willing to pay a substantial sum for it. He believed the plan was to allow the property taxes on Blue Heron House to accumulate, have the house condemned and demolished, the land absorbed into the resort development, and every record inside the house destroyed before anyone examined them closely enough to understand what had been there. They had not given Letha a worthless property. They had given her the grave of the last thing her father had tried to build, calculated to be too far gone and too expensive and too humiliating for a woman sleeping in a truck to do anything with. Letha set the notebook down on the floor beside her. She did not move for a long moment. The fire had burned lower. The pots under the ceiling leaks caught water in an irregular percussion. Buddy lay near the gap she had opened in the wall, his nose pointed toward the oilcloth package she had not yet opened. She reached for it. The oilcloth was stiff from age and cold, but had done its job. The package inside was dry. She worked the wax twine loose and unwrapped it, and found a letter addressed in Corbett's handwriting to a name she recognized as her own. She read it standing up, which was not a decision she made consciously. She was simply standing by the time she reached the third line. Corbett wrote that he was sorry. He was sorry for the years of shortened phone calls and visits that felt wrong, and the silence that had built itself between them while he was too sick and too ashamed to dismantle it. He was sorry he had not protected her better from the loneliness that had found her after she came home. He wrote that he had watched her from a distance, that he had allowed others to establish, and had not fought hard enough to close. Then he wrote, "You know what it means to have nowhere to sleep. Not as a lesson, not as something that happened to you and then was over. You know it as a condition of the body that changes how a person understands walls and warmth and the difference between being let in and being tolerated. That knowledge is not your shame. It never was. It is the reason I am trusting this to you and not to anyone else." Blue Heron House is not an inheritance of what I had, he wrote. It is an inheritance of what I was trying to do. If you are reading this, it means the house found you. And if the house found you, Buddy found it first. Listen to him. He has better judgment than most people I have known. Letha lowered the letter. She stood in the broken living room of Blue Heron House with her father's words in her hands and the fire low in the grate and the lake wind working through the gaps in the siding. And, for the first time since the church parking lot, since the law office, since the years of increasingly short phone calls, she understood something that reorganized everything that had come before it. She had not been forgotten. She had been trusted. There is a difference, and the difference is the distance between being left behind and being sent ahead. She did not cry immediately. What she felt was larger and quieter than crying. It was the sensation of a structure being set right after a long time of standing crooked, a slow correction that required the whole body to adjust. Buddy got up from his position near the wall and crossed the floor to her. He stood beside her right knee and leaned into it with the full weight of his old body, and she put her hand on the top of his head and stood there in the dark of what had been Blue Heron House and was now something she did not have a word for yet. She found the blueprint the next morning, tucked inside the canvas bundle, folded once along a horizontal crease. Corbett had drawn it himself, the lines precise in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime making measurements that matter. The drawing showed the property as he had imagined it restored. The house with its porch straight and its windows intact, the boathouse closer to the water with its doors rehung, the dock running clean into the lake. What held her attention were the red marks. 6 of them, each a small X drawn in the same careful hand, annotated in Corbett's shorthand beside each location, under the bedroom floor, behind the bookshelf, inside the boathouse, under the dock, beside a rocky hollow along the shore, inside the black iron box she had brought inside the previous night but had not yet opened. They were not treasure marks in any romantic sense of the word. They were the marks of a man who had anticipated that he might not be present when someone needed to find what he had hidden, and who had therefore left directions. Buddy moved from the blueprint to the door and looked back. She put on her coat. The boathouse stood near the water, with the posture of something that had been waiting in poor conditions for longer than was reasonable. Its roof had bowed along the center beam. The walls had taken on a green cast from the moisture coming off the lake, and the old fishing nets hanging from the interior rafters had dried into shapes that no longer suggested their original purpose. The door had been off its hinges for some time and rested at an angle against the frame. Buddy pushed through a collapsed section of netting and went directly to the far corner, beneath what remained of a wooden workbench. He began to dig with his front paws, not frantically but with the focused economy of a dog that has already located what it is looking for and is simply clearing the way. Letha knelt beside him and dug with her hands. The dirt was cold and packed, but not frozen solid. 8 inches down, her fingers found metal. The object was a sealed steel tube, the kind used for document storage, with a threaded cap that had been closed tight and sealed further with a ring of electrical tape gone brittle with age. She worked the cap off and tilted the tube, and 3 things slid into her palm. A brass key, small and heavy, with no identifying mark. A folded document that proved to be the original land deed for the entire shoreline parcel, including the acreage that Willa had described in the law office as already transferred to Witt, and incorporation papers for the Harbor House Fund, signed by Corbett Hartwick and witnessed by 2 names she did not recognize, dated 4 years earlier. Her father had not only dreamed of building a shelter, he had begun to build it in law. The fund existed. The land deed, in its original form, showed no transfer to Witt. Whatever documents Witt had used to claim the lakefront lots had been generated after this one and generated to contradict it. She held the deed in the cold air of the boathouse and understood that what she held was not evidence of what her father had hoped for. It was evidence of what Willa and Witt had done to stop it. The second mark took her back inside to the bedroom. She pried up 3 floorboards near the window that looked toward the lake, working the crowbar carefully to avoid splitting the wood she would need to relay. Under the third board, wrapped in waxed cloth that had done its job against the damp, she found a collection of treasury bonds. Old ones, paper certificates and denominations that added up, when she counted carefully, to enough. Not enough to make her wealthy, and the Willa understood wealth. Enough to fix the roof properly, to replace the windows with glass that sealed, to put beds in 3 rooms and a commercial stove in the kitchen. Corbett had not hidden a fortune. He had hidden a start. Behind the bookshelf in the living room was a bundle of letters, each in its own envelope, each addressed to Corbett in handwriting she did not know. She read them at the kitchen table, with Buddy asleep on the floor beside her chair. One came from a man named Fenwick Dunbar, a retired infantryman who wrote in a hand made uneven by some tremor he did not mention, thanking Corbett for a winter coat given in November and for a single phone call facilitated one February evening that had ended with his daughter agreeing to meet him for coffee. He had not spoken to her in 9 years before that phone call. He wrote that the coffee had lasted 3 hours. Another came from a man who signed himself only as Ray, a former Navy cook who described receiving soup and clean socks and a pillow that smelled of nothing except the detergent it had been washed in. He wrote, "I forgot that things could just smell like clean." It sounds small. It was not small. Letha read both letters twice. Then she set them beside the deed and the incorporation papers and the treasury bonds and looked at what was assembled on the table. Her father had been building a harbor, and Willa and Witt had been dismantling it quietly, piece by piece, from the inside. The mark beneath the dock was the hardest to read. The boards were slick from the recent snow, and the lake pressed against the pilings with a cold persistence that made the whole structure feel provisional. Letha moved out along it slowly, testing each board before she committed her weight, the crowbar looped through her belt. Buddy stayed at the shore end of the dock and watched. He had attempted to follow, and she had said no, and he had accepted this with the dignity of a soldier who understands the concept of a perimeter. Near the middle of the dock, she found a board that did not match its neighbors in color or grain. It had been replaced more recently than the others, fitted carefully enough that you would not notice it from a distance but would see it if you were looking. She worked the crowbar under its edge and pried it up, fastened to the crossbeam beneath, wrapped in multiple layers of black electrical tape and then sealed inside a Ziploc bag and then wrapped in more tape, a waterproof box the size of a hardcover book. Inside the box, 4 cassette tapes in paper sleeves, a manila envelope containing photographs of documents, handwritten figures, and what appeared to be copies of checks. A second envelope marked with Witt's full name in Corbett's handwriting, the ink pressed hard as if the act of writing the name required more force than usual. Letha sat on the dock in the cold with the box in her lap and read what her father had assembled. Witt had moved money out of the Harbor House Fund in increments calculated to fall below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. The photographs showed check copies and bank records annotated in Corbett's hand with dates, amounts, and a running total that reached, across 22 months, a sum large enough to cover the gambling debts that several of the documents referenced indirectly. There were no casino receipts. There were references to settlement amounts, to a name that appeared in 3 documents as a creditor, to wire transfers that moved money from a business account Corbett had established for the fund into an account registered to a company that Letha had never heard of, but that the documents suggested was controlled by Witt. Willa had signed off on 3 of the transfer documents as a co-administrator of the fund. Her signature appeared alongside Witt's on the pages that moved the largest amounts. And at the back of the manila envelope, a separate document on the letterhead of a real estate development company called North Star Retreats, a letter of intent, signed by a representative of the company and countersigned by Witt Blaine, expressing North Star's intention to purchase the entire lakefront parcel at a price that would require the demolition of all existing structures on the property, including the main house, the boathouse, and the dock, and the clearing of the wooded acreage to the east. The letter was dated 8 months ago. Letha sat on that dock for a long time. The lake moved under her in the patient way it had moved for 10,000 years before any of them existed. The cold came up through the boards. She did not feel it particularly. They had given her this place as a joke. They had been certain she would fail to do anything with it because they had been draining everything that could have supported it for nearly 2 years before Corbett died. And because they believed that a woman who had spent months sleeping in a truck did not possess the resources, the knowledge, or the audacity to open a sealed wall and understand what was inside it. They had been wrong about the dog. She carried everything back before dark, spread it across the living room floor in careful rows, and looked at what Corbett had assembled against the day someone would need it. Buddy lay down at the edge of the arrangement and rested his chin on the floor and watched her with his amber eyes. Orville Thorne arrived 3 mornings later in a battered green pickup, not because she had called him, but because, he said, Corbett had mentioned once that the house needed a carpenter and Orville had been slow getting to it. He said this without ceremony, dropped his toolbox on the porch, and began testing the structural integrity of the porch frame with a hammer and the focused attention of a man diagnosing a patient. This one can be saved, he said about the left side. That one's already gone, he said about the corner post. But gone isn't the same as unfixable. He did not ask what she had found in the wall. He seemed to understand, in the way of a man who had been friends with Corbett Hartwick for a long time, that she would tell him what was relevant when the time came. Using a portion of the bonds, Letha hired Orville on a practical basis and began the work of making the house habitable. The roof came first. Proper patching, not the blue tarp solution that had been keeping the worst of the weather out. Then the windows, replaced with glass that actually sealed against the cold. Then the kitchen stove, which had been disconnected at some point in the house's long vacancy and needed new fittings before it would hold a flame safely. No luxury appeared, no renovation in any magazine sense of the word. What appeared was warmth, dry floors, 3 bedrooms with actual beds and clean mattresses, a kitchen table that could seat 6. Faye Garfield arrived on a Wednesday, sent by a veterans legal advocacy organization Orville had contacted on Letha's behalf. She was 42, a compact woman with brown skin and dark eyes that processed information quickly and thoroughly, her black hair pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it herself in under a minute and had more important things to think about. Her briefcase was scratched at both corners. Her coat was plain navy wool. She sat at Letha's kitchen table and read through Corbett's papers with the systematic focus of someone who has learned to find the structural weakness in an argument before she addresses its surface. She said when she finished, "Your father built the legal foundation correctly. There are gaps because he ran out of time, but the bones are sound. We can work with this." Then she said, "They will fight it, and when they fight it, they will use everything they can find about your history." Letha said, "I know." The first resident of Harbor House arrived through the church food pantry on a Thursday afternoon. Fenwick Dunbar was 71 years old, the same man who had written to Corbett about the phone call and the coat. He was thin in the way of men whose bodies have been asked to do a great deal over many decades and have complied without always being compensated adequately in return. His eyes were a clouded blue that had seen things he was no longer interested in describing. His white beard was full but not tended. His shoulders curved forward under some permanent weight, the particular posture of a man who has spent too long on cold seats and hard floors. He stood at the door of Harbor House with a grocery bag containing everything he owned and apologized before Letha had said anything, as if warmth were a thing he might damage simply by accepting it. She said, "Come in, Fenwick." Corbett told me about the phone call. He looked at her for a moment. Then he came inside. Glennis Fenwick arrived 2 days later, referred by the same church. She was 68, a widow with silver hair braided down her back and hands that had been made rough by 30 years of cleaning other people's houses, a career that had ended when her own body began requiring the kind of medical attention that consumed, in succession, her savings, her car, and then her rental. She carried herself with the deliberate dignity of someone who has decided that circumstances are not permitted to determine bearing. When Letha showed her the small bedroom at the end of the hallway, Glennis reached out and touched the folded blanket on the bed with 2 fingers. She said, "I forgot what this felt like." She said it quietly, to herself more than to Letha, the way people say things they have been holding for a long time and have finally found a place to set down. Hollis Voss came near dusk on a Friday 20 miles on foot from the county shelter that had run out of beds. He was 32, tall and thin, in a hooded jacket that had been adequate for October and was insufficient for January. His blonde hair was cropped close. His eyes were a pale green that moved constantly, tracking the perimeter of every room he entered before they settled on the people in it. He had been an army mechanic. He had been good at it. Loud sounds still made his jaw lock in a way he had no control over, as if some part of him remained stationed somewhere he could not leave. Buddy approached him slowly, without the performance of friendliness, simply walking across the floor with the measured pace of an old dog who has nothing to prove. Hollis lowered one hand to his side. Buddy sniffed it. Then Buddy stood beside Hollis's left leg and was still, not leaning, not pressing, simply present in the specific way that communicates. You are not alone in this room. Hollis's hand moved to the top of Buddy's head. It was trembling slightly. He stayed. That evening, Harbor House held people for the first time in the way Corbett had imagined it holding people. Soup on the stove that Letha had repaired. Rain on the windows instead of through the roof. Fenwick sat at the kitchen table with a mug in both hands and said very little, which seemed to be exactly what he needed. Glennis folded a stack of donated towels with a careful precision that was its own kind of statement. Hollis stood near the door to the hallway for most of the evening, positioning himself where he could see both the kitchen and the front entrance, which was the arrangement that made the most sense to him and which no one commented on. Buddy moved through the house on a slow circuit, pausing at each person for a moment. He did not perform comfort. He simply confirmed presence, the way a good sentry confirms a perimeter, and then moved on to the next post. Behind Hollis, trailing through the door before Letha thought to close it, came a dog she had found that morning near the gas station at the edge of town. An old hound, tan and thin, one paw white, ears too large for his tired face, ribs visible through his coat. He had been sitting at the edge of the station lot in the cold, with the patience of an animal that has run out of options and knows it. She had not planned to bring him. But he had looked at her in a way that did not leave room for leaving him. Buddy assessed the new arrival with a brief and thorough inspection. The hound attempted within 4 minutes of entering the house to claim Buddy's blanket beside the fireplace. Buddy looked at him, held the look for a considered moment, then stepped aside. Letha laughed before she knew she was going to. It came out sudden and unguarded, and every person in the room looked up. It was the first time she had laughed in longer than she could calculate. The sound of it surprised her almost as much as it surprised them. Harbor House breathed that night. Something in the structure of the place, the old cedar and the stone fireplace, and the windows that now kept the cold where it belonged, seemed to settle differently with people inside it. The way any built thing settles when it is finally being used for the purpose it was made for. The attacks began with paper, which is how most serious damage begins. 11 days after Fenwick arrived, a legal notice from the offices of Stanton Garfield appeared at the house. Crane was Willa's attorney, a man with a reputation for winning through attrition rather than merit, for filing motions, the way you move pieces in a game designed to make the other play run out of energy before the board is decided. The notice challenged Letha's legal standing to manage the property and administer any charitable fund associated with it. It described her as financially unstable, chronically unemployed, formerly homeless, and emotionally compromised by military service. Each word had been chosen with care. None of them were technically false. The next morning, Faye came to the house and sat across from Letha at the kitchen table with a copy of the notice and 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who is about to say something the other person needs to hear. There is a gap in your father's registration, she said. He did not complete the final filing for the Harbor House Fund before he died. It exists in law, but not in the public record, which is the gap Crane is going to try to widen into something that swallows the whole structure. Letha said, "What are you recommending?" Faye said, "A negotiated settlement, something that allows you to retain the house and possibly a reduced version of the fund's mandate, while conceding the lakefront parcel. It is not what your father wanted, but it is survivable." Letha sat with that for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, Fenwick was splitting wood near the shed with a methodical patience that seemed to have its own dignity. She watched him for a moment. "If we give them the lakefront," she said, "they demolish the boathouse, the dock, everything my father hid to protect this place." Faye said, "Yes, and in 6 months, Harbor House is surrounded by a resort development. That is the likely outcome." Letha looked at Faye across the table. "My father did not build this to survive at reduced capacity," she said. "He built it to be used. We are not negotiating it down." Faye held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. She closed the folder on the table. "Then we need better evidence than what we have," she said. "Not better than the bonds and the deed. Better than what Crane already knows we have." That conversation was still unresolved when the black SUV arrived. It came on a Saturday afternoon, moving up the muddy track to the house with the unhurried confidence of something that does not expect to be turned away, Willa emerged first, in a cream coat with the posture of a person who has arranged the weather in advance. Wit followed in charcoal, his face holding the tight expression of a man whose anger has been channeled into something more controlled, but no less dangerous. Behind them came a third person Letha had not seen before. A man in his 50s, tall and lean, with silver hair and the complexion of someone who has spent time in warmer climates. His shoes were polished to a standard that required daily attention. His name, Willa introduced, was Silas Dunbar. Silas Dunbar represented North Star Retreats. He did not look at Fenwick, who had stopped splitting wood and was watching from near the shed. He did not look at Glennis, who had come to stand in the doorway. He looked at Blue Heron House with the particular gaze of a man calculating what a structure might be worth once it was no longer standing. Willa said, "You have made quite a sentimental arrangement here." She said it the way you describe something you are preparing to dismantle. Silas Dunbar explained the situation in the smooth, reasonable tone of a man accustomed to delivering uncomfortable information as if it were ordinary. The lakefront parcel had been under a letter of intent for 8 months. Witt had signed on behalf of the estate. North Star's development timeline had already been presented to the county planning board. The investment commitment from North Star's side was substantial, and if the transaction failed at this stage, there would be financial consequences that would affect the broader estate. He left a folder on the porch rail when he finished speaking. Inside was what he described as a courtesy copy of the development plan. Letha looked at it after they drove away. The folder contained detailed site maps. The main house was marked for demolition. The boathouse was marked for demolition. The dock was marked for removal and replacement with private boat slips. The wooded acreage to the east, including the rocky hollow along the shore where Corbett had marked one of his red X locations, was designated for grading. Willa and Witt had not only planned to sell the land, they had planned with the architectural precision of people who understand how thorough erasure works to destroy every physical location where Corbett had hidden anything. That night, rain moved in hard from the lake. Letha sat on the porch with her hands loose at her sides, watching the dark water. Inside, Fenwick was doing something to an axe that did not need doing. Glennis was refolding towels she had already folded. Hollis checked the window locks twice. She thought about the bonds, about a small apartment, about what it would feel like to hand this back. She thought about it until she felt the true weight of it, and then she stopped. She had been in this house long enough to understand something her father had understood before her. The people inside it did not have anywhere else to go. That was not a sentiment. That was a material fact with specific consequences for specific lives. Fenwick's daughter had answered the phone. Glennis had touched a clean blanket and remembered what softness was. Hollis had allowed a dog to stand beside him in the dark. None of that could be negotiated down to a smaller version of itself. She was still sitting with that when Buddy stood up, not gradually. He did not lift his head first or shift his weight. He simply went from lying to standing in a single motion, his attention already fixed on the far end of the porch, his body oriented toward the boathouse. He went off the porch at a run. No warning, no preliminary sound. Just movement, direct and committed, in the direction of the water, barking with a force Letha had not heard from him since the night the wall opened. She was off the porch before she had decided to move. She had the flashlight from her coat pocket in her hand. Behind her, she heard the door open and Fenwick and Hollis come out at a run, Fenwick still carrying the axe he had been pretending to sharpen. The flashlight beam cut through the rain and found the boathouse. Whit Blaine was standing at the boathouse door. One hand was on a padlock that had already been broken. His other arm held a metal box against his body, the waterproof box from beneath the dock boards. On the ground beside the open door, an oil pan held a small fire, and scattered around it were documents, some already burning, some caught in the wet wind, their edges black. He had come to burn what remained. His face, when the light found it, was white in a way that had nothing to do with cold. He said, "This is family property," and his voice broke in the middle of the sentence, the crack of it audible even in the rain. Buddy stood in the doorway of the boathouse. He had not touched Whit. He had simply positioned himself between Whit and any direction that led away from the light, and the teeth he showed were explanation enough. Hollis moved past Letha. He had spotted something above the workbench inside the boathouse, something Orville had mounted to the wall the previous week without particular ceremony. A small camera. Its red indicator light blinked steadily in the dark, the way a lighthouse blinks, the way any reliable light blinks. without drama, without interruption, recording everything. The rain came down. The fire in the oil pan sputtered and held. Whit Blaine stood in the doorway of the boathouse with Buddy between him and escape, and the camera recorded it all. In the morning, Faye Garfield sat at Letha's kitchen table with the recovered box, the partially burned documents, the footage on Orville's phone, and Corbett's papers spread before her. Her eyes were tired, her voice was not. "This changes everything," she said. "The footage alone is enough to alter the legal landscape entirely." She paused. "But it also means they will come harder now. And when we walk into that courtroom, Stanton Garfield is going to put your entire life on the table in front of a judge and ask her to find you insufficient." Letha looked across the table at her. Then she looked at Buddy, who was lying near the front door with his chin on his paws, his eyes half closed, still guarding even in exhaustion. She folded her hands on the table. "I am not ashamed of how I have lived," she said. "The shame belongs to people with too many houses who never opened a door." Faye looked at her for a moment. Then she opened her legal pad and began to write. The courthouse stood at the center of Fairhaven, the way courthouses always stand, with the particular gravity of a building that has been asked to hold the weight of other people's worst days. Its stone steps were glazed with frost that had not melted by 9 in the morning. Its tall windows reflected a sky the color of old pewter. The American flag above the entrance moved without enthusiasm in a wind coming off the lake. Letha arrived in a borrowed suit. Orville had produced it from the back of his truck without ceremony. Brown wool with a faint check in the weave, the sleeves half an inch too long, the shoulders broad enough that the jacket sat slightly wide on her frame. She had not asked where it came from. She suspected it had belonged to someone Orville had known well and lost. He had kept it because some things are too specific to give away to strangers, but can be lent to the right person at the right time. She wore it with her old work boots because she had no other shoes. This did not embarrass her. She had decided somewhere between the porch the previous evening and the truck this morning that she was finished with the particular kind of shame that comes from being seen in inadequate clothing. She had earned the right to walk into any room in the clothes she had. Buddy could not go into the courtroom. This was the rule, and it was absolute, and Letha accepted it without argument. She brought him as far as the entrance of the building, where Orville took his leash without being asked. Buddy sat down immediately, as if he understood the arrangement, and looked at Letha with his amber eyes in a way that communicated nothing she could put into words and everything she needed. Fenwick stood to Orville's left. Glennis stood on the other side. Hollis positioned himself slightly apart from the group, facing the hallway rather than the room, maintaining his habitual awareness of entry points. They had all come without being asked. None of them had said much during the drive. Some things do not require discussion. Letha went in alone. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected and more formal than she had anticipated. The wood paneling on the walls had been maintained with the care that institutional spaces receive when the institution values its own dignity. The gallery benches were half full. People from town she recognized by sight but not by name. A reporter from the county paper with a notebook open on his knee, and in the front row on the left side, Willa Blaine in pale cashmere with her hands folded as if she were attending a ceremony in which she had already been told the outcome. Whit sat beside her in a dark suit. He had been touching his tie repeatedly since Letha entered, a small adjustment that required no adjustment, the gesture of a man whose hands need occupation. Stanton Garfield sat at the table to their left, a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a face that had settled into permanent irritability and small eyes that processed the room with the efficient disinterest of someone who has already categorized everyone in it. He had a reputation that Orville had described in 2 sentences on the drive over. He wins by making the other side run out of money or patience, whichever comes first. He has never been the smartest lawyer in any room he has entered, but he has always been the most relentless. Faye was already at the table on the right when Letha sat down beside her. She had arranged the documents in a specific order that Letha had watched her develop over the past week, not by date, not by type, but by the sequence in which they would be most damaging to the story Stanton Garfield was about to tell. Faye had a quality that became more apparent under pressure, the quality of becoming more precise as circumstances became more chaotic, as if difficulty were a kind of focusing instrument for her. Judge Opal Voss entered and the room stood. She was a black woman in her early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and a square, composed face that had spent years developing the particular neutrality of someone who has heard a great many arguments and long ago stopped being surprised by the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is theirs. She moved to the bench with the economy of someone who wastes nothing, not words, not gestures, not attention. She sat. She looked at the room once, the way you look at a room you intend to be responsible for. Then she opened the case file. Stanton Garfield began. He was good at what he did. Letha had known he would be, and knowing it did not make it easier to sit still and hear it. He laid out his argument with the smooth confidence of a man who has organized the same case many times under different names. The plaintiff, one Letha Hartwick, was a woman without steady employment, without a permanent residence for the 4 months preceding her father's death, without financial stability of any kind, and without the institutional knowledge necessary to administer a charitable fund or manage a property of this complexity. He described her military service not as something that conferred dignity or competence, but as a source of documented emotional difficulty that had contributed, in his framing, to her prolonged inability to maintain stable circumstances. He said the word homeless 3 times in the first 10 minutes. He said it the way you use a specific tool for a specific purpose, with precision and without apology. Letha kept her hands flat on the table in front of her, and her eyes on a point slightly above Crane's left shoulder, and breathed at a pace she controlled deliberately. Beside her, Faye was still. When Crane finished his opening, Faye rose. She did not match his volume or his rhythm. She spoke at the pace of someone presenting evidence to a person she trusts to understand it, which was the correct read of Judge Voss, who was watching the documents as Faye named them rather than watching Faye's face. The Harbor House Fund Incorporation Papers, filed 4 years before Corbett's death, properly witnessed, legally valid despite the incomplete final registration that Stanton Garfield had planned to exploit. Faye had spent 6 days locating the filing and 3 hours on the phone with the county clerk's office confirming its status. It existed. It had existed the entire time Willa and Witt were treating it as if it did not. The original land deed for the shoreline parcel, retrieved from the sealed tube beneath the boathouse floor, it predated by 4 years the transfer documents Witt had used to claim the lots. The signatures on those later documents, Faye noted, had been sent for forensic handwriting analysis at Faye's request, and the preliminary findings were available to the court. The bank records from Corbett's documentation, showing the pattern of withdrawals from the Harbor House Fund account, the copies of checks, the wire transfer records, the financial trail that Corbett had assembled with the methodical patience of a man who understood that evidence, like a well-built structure, needs to be laid in a specific order to hold weight. The letter of intent between Whit Blaine and North Star Retreats, signed nearly a year before Corbett's death, committing to the demolition of every structure on the property, and the footage from Orville's camera, which Faye played on a laptop screen turned toward the bench, showing Whit Blaine at the boathouse door in the rain with a broken padlock in one hand and a metal box in the other, and on the ground beside him the oil pan with the fire and the burning documents. The courtroom grew quieter with each piece of evidence, not the quiet of disinterest, but the quiet of people recalibrating what they believed was happening in the room. Orville testified. He was the same in the witness box as he was behind the hardware counter, unhurried, direct, without decoration. He described Corbett Hartwick as a man who had told him, on more than one occasion over more than a decade of friendship, that he intended to restore Blue Heron House for the specific purpose of providing shelter and support to veterans who had come home to circumstances that did not match what they had been promised when they left. He said, Corbett was not a man who said things he did not mean. He was a carpenter. He built things to last. Fenwick testified next. He had dressed carefully for the occasion in a flannel shirt that was clean and pressed, and he held himself in the witness box with the particular straightness of a man who has decided that whatever comes of this, he will face it without flinching. He described sleeping on the bench at the bus station on Keller Street through November and December, and what it meant when Corbett Hartwick had appeared one afternoon with a coat and no questions, and what it had meant later when Harbor House had a room with a bed and a door that locked. He said, I had stopped expecting doors to open for me. When one did, I did not know what to do with it for a while. I am still learning. Glennis spoke in a voice that was steady and quiet and carried in the courtroom the way quiet voices carry when Everyone in the room has stopped making noise to hear them. She described the blanket. She described what it had been like to touch a folded blanket on a bed in a room where the door locked and understand that the room was hers for as long as she needed it. She said, I cleaned houses for 30 years. I knew how a house was supposed to feel from the inside. I had forgotten that I was allowed to know that from the living side rather than the working side. Then Hollis. He had been in the hallway during the previous testimonies, moving, the way he moved in enclosed spaces with too many people, with the contained energy of a man whose body and mind have not yet reached a full agreement about the current level of threat. When his name was called, he came in and sat in the witness box, and his hands on the railing were not entirely still. He said very little. He said it without looking at Whit or Willa. He said it to the judge, or to a point just past the judge's left shoulder, which is sometimes the same thing. He said, the dog slept outside my door. Some nights the dark gets loud in a way that other people cannot hear. On those nights, I could hear Buddy breathing on the other side of the door, and it was enough. He paused. He said, I know that sounds like a small thing. Judge Voss said, it does not sound small to me. The courtroom was very quiet. Then Letha was called. She walked to the witness box and sat down and looked at Stanton Garfield, who was already rising, and felt, to her own mild surprise, something close to calm. Not the calm of someone who has stopped feeling, but the calm of someone who has organized their feeling into something that can be directed. Crane asked her whether she had, at the time of inheriting Blue Heron House, been living in a vehicle. She said, yes. He asked whether she had, in the months preceding the inheritance, relied on food provided by charitable organizations. She said, yes. He asked whether she had maintained any form of stable employment in the 2 years prior. She said, no. He asked whether she had sought treatment for the psychological effects of her military service. She paused at that one, not because she did not have an answer, but because she wanted to give the right one. She said, I have been managing what the military left in me since I came home. I will be managing it for the rest of my life. That is not instability. That is what the work looks like from the inside. Crane moved on. He asked whether she believed she was qualified to administer a charitable organization. She said, I believe I understand what the organization is for. He asked her to explain what she meant. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Judge Voss. She said, I was homeless. I was hungry. I spent months being looked at by people who had decided before I spoke a single word that I was a problem rather than a person. I know what that does to a human being over time. I know what it means when someone opens a door without requiring you to justify your right to come in from the cold. My father built Harbor House for people who have had that door closed on them too many times. I am not standing here to argue that I am qualified by any credential on a piece of paper. I am standing here because I am the person my father trusted to keep his door open, and because the people sleeping in that house tonight have nowhere else to go. She stopped. She had said what she came to say. The room held the silence for a moment. Then Stanton Garfield said he had one more question, and he said it with the particular preparation of someone who has been saving a specific thing for a specific moment. He said, isn't it true that your father signed over administrative control of the Harbor House Fund to Willa Blaine 3 weeks before his death, a document that was filed with the county clerk's office and which represents the legal supersession of all prior arrangements? He slid a document across to Faye. Faye took it without changing her expression. She read it. Letha watched her eyes move across the page. Then Faye set it down on the table. She said, I would like to request a brief recess to examine this document. Judge Voss granted it. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Faye laid the document on a bench, and Letha stood beside her while Faye went through it section by section, not quickly, not slowly, but at the pace of someone who is looking for the specific thing they already suspect is there. Orville stood at the end of the corridor with Buddy sitting at his feet. Buddy's eyes were on the courtroom door. He did not look away from it. Faye found what she was looking for on the third page. The signature was Corbett Hartwick's name. It had his general shape, the lean of his H, the particular way he closed his lowercase a. It was close, it was practiced, and it was wrong in 4 places that Faye circled with a pen borrowed from the court reporter. She had seen Corbett's signature on 47 documents over the past 3 weeks. She knew his hand in the way you know a voice you have listened to carefully, not by any single feature, but by the whole of it. She said, this is not his signature. Letha looked at it. She said, I know. They went back in. Faye presented her analysis to Judge Voss with the same directness she had applied to every other piece of evidence. Here is the document. Here are the 4 points of deviation from the established signature pattern across 47 verified examples. Here is the request that the court order an independent forensic handwriting examination before this document is accepted as valid. Stanton Garfield objected. Judge Voss overruled him. Witt's hand had stopped touching his tie. He sat very still. Willa, beside him, had the expression of someone who has been maintaining a particular posture for so long that the muscles have begun quietly to fail. The forensic examiner, contacted by phone and available to speak to the court within the hour, because Faye had anticipated this possibility 3 days ago and made arrangements, confirmed that the signature showed characteristics inconsistent with Corbett Hartwick's documented signing pattern across the sample Faye had assembled. Judge Voss set the document aside. She asked Stanton Garfield whether he wished to continue his line of questioning. Crane said he did not. Judge Voss spent 45 minutes reviewing the assembled evidence. The courtroom waited with the specific patience of people who understand that the outcome is being determined in real time and that there is nothing left to do that would help. Then she spoke. Letha Hartwick was confirmed as the lawful heir and legal administrator of Harbor House and the Harbor House Fund. The transfer documents Witt had used to claim the lakefront lots were referred for further investigation. The North Star Development Agreement was suspended pending the resolution of that investigation. Stanton Garfield's challenge to Letha's fitness to administer the property was denied in its entirety. Willa and Witt were referred to the county prosecutor's office for investigation on multiple grounds: misappropriation of charitable funds, falsification of legal documents, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to defraud. The fabricated signature document was referred to a separate forensic unit for criminal analysis. Witt's face did not collapse so much as it simply stopped holding. Whatever structure had been maintaining his expression released without announcement, and what remained was something younger and less composed than anything he had shown in the law office 6 weeks ago. Willa sat beside him with her hands still folded and her face held rigid in a way that looked increasingly like the last thing standing. Letha sat at the table and breathed. She did not feel triumph. She had expected, perhaps, some version of it, the satisfaction of a thing corrected that had been wrong for a long time. What she felt instead was quieter and more physical, the sensation of a weight that had been distributed unevenly across her body for weeks, finding its proper position and settling. She thought about Corbett at the boathouse, hiding a tube under the dirt floor with a document inside it, trusting that someone would find it when it mattered. She thought about the photograph in the black iron box she had not yet opened, the one she had carried to the courthouse in her coat pocket, because she had not wanted to leave it in the house and had not been ready to look at it yet. She had not opened the box. She would open it tonight. In the corridor, Buddy was on his feet before the door swung open. He did not run. He walked forward the length of his leash and Orville released it, and Buddy came the rest of the way to Letha and stood before her and looked up at her with his amber eyes, and she bent and put both hands on the sides of his face. The corridor felt warmer than it had that morning. Orville said nothing. He put a hand briefly on Letha's shoulder and then removed it. Fenwick nodded once, the nod of a man who has seen a thing turn out right and finds it meets his estimate of how things should be. Glennis had her hands pressed together at her chest and her eyes were bright. Hollis stood at the corridor's edge with his arms crossed and his jaw working slightly, the expression of a man feeling something he has not yet developed the vocabulary for. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon had turned gray and still. The frost on the steps had finally given way to the temperature. Silas Dunbar was waiting at the bottom of the step. He stood apart from the small group of reporters and observers who had gathered during the session. His silver hair was uncovered. His coat was the same as it had been that afternoon at the house, polished and precise, but something in his posture had changed from the studied ease he had carried then. He held a sealed envelope. He said, "North Star has withdrawn from the agreement. The liability exposure made it untenable once the investigation was announced." Letha said nothing. She waited. He said, "I have been in real estate development for 27 years. I have built things I am proud of, and I have been part of things I am not." He paused. "A veterans advocacy organization at the state level has been looking for a model facility for 2 years. They want something that operates rather than theorizes." He held out the envelope. "This is a contact, not a commitment. What you do with it is your business. Letha looked at the envelope. She thought about what her father had written about the man who needed a coat in November, about the man who had cried over a clean blanket, about Thomas at the bus station on Keller Street. She took the envelope. She said, "My father believed that even people who had taken wrong steps could do right ones." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. That evening, Harbor House held light the way a lighthouse holds light, not for itself but as a signal, as an orientation point for things moving through the dark towards somewhere they can stop. The yellow glow from the repaired windows reached across the surface of Lake Ontario in long, unsteady lines that shifted with the water. In the kitchen, soup moved on the stove. Orville and Fenwick played chess at the end of the table with the focused quiet of two men who have found a use for each other's company. Glennis folded blankets that had come in a donation box that afternoon, working through the pile with a care that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with the understanding that a folded blanket waiting in a drawer is a kind of promise made in advance to someone who has not arrived yet. Hollis stood on a stepladder at the front of the house, his breath visible in the cold, repainting the wooden sign above the porch with the careful attention of a mechanic approaching a precision task. The letters came out clean and dark against the pale wood. Harbor House, no one sleeps alone. He climbed down and looked at it for a moment, then went back inside without comment, which was exactly right. The tan hound, rounder now after 3 weeks of regular meals, had graduated from stealing Buddy's blanket to simply occupying half of it by gradual displacement, a strategy Buddy tolerated with the resigned dignity of a senior official who has learned to choose his battles. They lay before the fireplace in a loose arrangement of old bones and old fur, the hound's enormous ears spread against the floor like something that had stopped trying to stand up. Letha stood on the porch in the cold with her coat open at the throat. The snow that had been building all day was arriving now, not in the hard-driving way of the worst winter storms, but in the careful, deliberate way of snow that intends to stay. It covered the porch rail and the wood pile and the roof of the boathouse and the surface of the lake in the same patient white. She had the black iron box in her hands. She had carried it from the courthouse to the truck and from the truck to the house, and she had set it on the kitchen counter during dinner, and she had looked at it from across the room while the soup cooled in the bowls and the conversation moved around the table, and she had not been ready. She was ready now. The hasp opened without a key. Corbett had not locked it. He had closed it and trusted that the right person would open it when the time was right, and the time was right now, and the person was her. Inside was a photograph she had never seen, which was strange because it showed people she knew well. It showed Corbett Hartwick and a child of 7 or 8, standing in front of Blue Heron House in the summer, the lake visible in the background, the porch straight and the windows intact, and the cedar of the siding still bright from a recent staining. Corbett had the child on his left arm, held easily, with the unconscious confidence of a man who has carried children this way many times. The child was looking at the lake. He was looking at the child. He was laughing. Not for a camera, not for anyone watching. Laughing at something in the moment, something private, something between the two of them that existed only in that fraction of a second. Letha had not seen her father laugh that way since before she left. She had not remembered that he could. Under the photograph was a piece of paper, smaller than the other letters, the writing more uneven than anything else he had left, the letters pressed into the page with less force, as if written when force was becoming a limited resource. He had written, "You always knew how to stay with people who were hurting. I did not teach you that. You brought it with you. Do not let anyone convince you that it is a burden. It is the thing that made you the right one for this. It is the thing that made you mine." Letha stood on the porch of Harbor House, with the photograph in one hand and the letter in the other, and the snow came down around her in the quiet, patient way of something that has waited a long time and is finally arriving where it was always going. Inside, Buddy had moved to the door. He had not been told to. He simply went, the way he had gone to the wall that first night, the way he had gone to the boathouse in the rain. He lay down against the base of the door and rested his chin on the threshold and breathed slowly in the warmth coming from inside, and his amber eyes, half closed, found Letha through the glass. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at the snow on the lake. She looked at the light in the windows. She folded both pieces of paper and put them in her coat pocket, close to her chest, where she had carried the deed on the day she walked out of the senior partner's office with nothing except what her father had left her, which had turned out to be enough, which had turned out to be exactly enough. 3 weeks after the courthouse, a letter arrived from the State Veterans Advocacy Organization, whose contact Silas Dunbar had handed Letha on the courthouse steps. It was not a long letter. It said that two representatives would like to visit Harbor House at a mutually convenient time, that they had heard about the property from multiple sources and were interested in what was being built there, and that they were not coming to evaluate whether Harbor House met their criteria, but to understand what Harbor House already was. Letha read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Fenwick made coffee, and the hound pushed his enormous ears against her shin in a bid for attention that had become his standard morning strategy. She read it twice. Then she set it face up on the table, where Faye could see it when she arrived that afternoon. She did not allow herself to feel certain about what it meant. She had learned, over the years of her life that had required the most of her, that certainty applied in advance to good things is a specific kind of vulnerability. She set the letter on the table and went to work. There was always work. That had not changed. The eastern wall of the house needed the insulation replaced inside a 6-foot section where the original material had never been adequate and the cold came through by January in ways that the residents felt at night. The boathouse, cleared now of its decades of accumulated debris and emptied of everything Whit had tried to burn, had become Hollis's project. He had been in there most mornings since the courthouse, bringing order to the space with the same methodical attention he had once given to military equipment, assessing what was worth keeping, discarding what was past repair, identifying what the space could become if someone applied patience and correct procedure. He had not said what he intended. He simply worked, and Letha had learned early that Hollis communicated more reliably through action than through words, which was not a limitation, but a different language that required a different kind of listening. Orville came on Saturdays as he always had. He brought coffee from the diner on Main Street, a standing purchase that the diner had begun to anticipate and prepare in advance, which was how things worked in small towns between people who have established a reliable pattern. He and Fenwick had developed over the weeks the kind of friendship that grows between men of a certain age and temperament, functional, largely wordless, based on mutual recognition of quality rather than any explicit statement of regard. They played chess. Orville usually lost. Neither of them mentioned this. Faye came on Wednesdays. She was working in the time she did not spend on Harbor House matters, on the regulatory filings required to fully establish the fund in the public record, closing the gap that Stanton Garfield had tried to widen into a demolition order. The work was painstaking in the way that legal reconstruction is always painstaking, not dramatic, not visible from the outside, the kind of effort that looks like nothing until it is done and then looks, retrospectively, like the only thing that mattered. She also filed a complaint against Stanton Garfield regarding the fabricated signature document. This was a separate process from the criminal investigation of Willa and Whit, slower and more procedural, but Faye pursued it with the same even focus she applied to everything. Crane had practiced law in the county for 23 years. He had a reputation. She intended to give that reputation the attention it had been avoiding. Dr. Shirley Colwell came without a schedule, which was her way. She arrived when she could, stayed as long as was useful, checked on Buddy and the hound with the thoroughness of someone who takes her obligations seriously, regardless of whether they are compensated, and left notes in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Buddy's hips had improved since January. The enforced rest during the period before the courthouse had done what rest is supposed to do, which is to say it had allowed the body to apply its own resources to its own problems without additional demand. He moved more easily now than he had in November, not young again, not anything close to young, but present and capable in the way of old things that have been properly cared for. The hound had no medical history to speak of, which was itself a kind of history. Faye had given him a thorough examination on her second visit, found nothing that time and adequate food and warmth had not already begun to address, and pronounced him, with clinical precision, a lucky old dog. He accepted this diagnosis with complete indifference and returned to his primary occupation, which was occupying floor space in the warmest available location. The day the representatives from the advocacy organization arrived was overcast and cold but not bitter, the kind of February day that is enduring rather than aggressive. Their car, a practical gray sedan, came up the track in the late morning and parked on the gravel Orville had laid along the side of the house to address the mud problem that had made the approach impassable during thaw. There were two of them. A man named Douglas Hart, who was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, with a veteran's economy of movement and the bearing of someone who has held command and set it down without regret. A woman named Patricia Soames, who was younger, perhaps 40, with a planner's habit of taking in a space systematically before she spoke about it. They had driven from the state capital, which was 4 hours away, and they had come without the preliminary hedging language that organizations often send ahead of themselves. Letha met them at the door. Buddy was beside her. He assessed both visitors with his standard brief examination and then moved aside, which was his version of endorsement. She showed them the house, not as a presentation, not in the way you show something you are trying to sell, but in the way you show someone around a place you actually live. Here is what works. Here is what still needs work. Here is why things are arranged the way they are. The kitchen that could seat 8 at the table Orville had built in November. The 3 bedrooms, each with 2 beds now, each with a window that opened onto either the lake or the tree line. The sunroom at the east end that had become, through no particular design decision, the room where people went when they needed quiet. Hollis's room during loud afternoons, Fenwick's room on the mornings when the chess game had not yet started, the hound's room whenever the sun found the east-facing windows and pooled on the floor. Douglas Hart asked questions that showed he had read what Faye had sent, specific questions about the fund's legal structure, about the intake process for residents, about what services Harbor House provided beyond physical shelter and how those services were currently resourced. He asked about capacity. He asked about waitlist. Letha told him there was no formal waitlist. She told him that the way Harbor House worked was that people arrived through the networks that struggling people move through. Church programs, food pantries, word passed person to person in the specific subterranean way that information moves among people who do not trust official channels. She told him that she had not yet turned anyone away, not because Harbor House had unlimited capacity, but because so far, the need and the space had found each other at a rate that was manageable, and she intended to keep it that way as long as she could and expand when she could not. Patricia Soames had been moving through the house slowly, looking at things with the particular attention of someone cataloging rather than admiring. She stopped in the doorway of the sunroom. The hound was there, ears spread against the floor in the patch of pale winter sun that had found its way through the east windows. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "How many people have you housed since you opened?" Letha said, 11. 3 are still here. The others moved on to more stable situations, 3 of them to permanent housing, 2 to family they had re-established contact with, the others to arrangements I do not know the details of, but that they chose for themselves. Soames wrote something in her notebook. Hart said, "The organization has been looking for 2 years for a facility that operates from principles rather than from policy. What we have mostly found is facilities that started from principles and became policy after the first funding cycle." He paused. He looked at the kitchen table, at the chess pieces Fenwick had left in their overnight position, at the stack of folded blankets on the counter. He said, "What you have built here is what we were looking for, before we had the language to describe it." Letha did not say anything immediately. She had learned to be careful with moments that arrived carrying the weight of things she wanted very much, because wanting very much had historically been the prelude to the most specific kinds of loss. She let the moment exist without adding to it. Then she said, "My father built it. I am maintaining it." Hart said, "From what I can see, you are doing considerably more than maintaining it." They stayed for 4 hours. They talked about funding, about the structure of the grant the organization could provide, about the conditions attached, and the reporting requirements and the timeline. The grant was not a fortune. It was enough to add beds, to bring in a part-time mental health professional 2 days a week, to establish a modest operational budget that would make the next year less dependent on Treasury bonds and Orville's hardware account. Patricia Soames spent the last hour of the visit in the boathouse with Hollis. Letha could see them through the boathouse window from where she stood, talking with Hart on the dock. Soames was looking at what Hollis had done to the space. The workbenches cleared and relaid at proper heights, the tools organized along the wall in the manner of a man who understands that a tool kept in its place is a tool that can be found when it is needed. Hollis was explaining something. his hands moving in the precise gestures of a mechanic describing a process. He was not checking corners, he was not monitoring exits. He was standing in the space he had built and explaining it to someone who wanted to understand it. Letha watched this through the boathouse window for a long moment. This was not a small thing. After Hart and Soames left, with the grant paperwork to be formalized over the following 3 weeks and handshakes that were neither ceremonial nor perfunctory but simply conclusive, Letha sat on the dock with Buddy beside her and the lake moving under them in the slow gray way of water in late winter, and she thought about her father. She thought about him hiding the tube under the boathouse floor, working in the cold with hands that were already beginning to fail him, pressing the cap down tight and resealing it with tape. She thought about him writing in the notebook in the evenings while Willa's attention was elsewhere, documenting what he had built and what had been taken from it and what remained. She thought about him folding the photograph into the black iron box and closing the hasp and trusting that someone would find it. She thought about the line from his last letter, the one she had read on the porch in the snow and carried in her coat pocket every day since. "You brought it with you." She understood what he had meant, not as a compliment, not as comfort, but as a description of something factual. The capacity to stay with people who were hurting, to remain present in difficult rooms without requiring the difficulty to end before your presence was valid. That was not something the military had given her, not something suffering had given her, not something Corbett had taught her at a kitchen table. It had come with her. It had survived everything that had tried to take it. She had spent years treating it as a liability, as the reason she could not leave the church parking lot behind, the reason other people's pain reached her in ways that made ordinary life feel impossible. The weight of it had contributed to the silence with her father, to the years of shortened calls, to the truck and the frozen windshield and the $40 and the dog who had recognized her from across a room. Sitting on the dock with Buddy warm against her side, with the boathouse at her back now inhabited by purpose rather than neglect, with the light from the house reaching the water in front of her in unsteady lines, she understood that she had never been carrying a burden. She had been carrying a lantern. The years of difficulty had not diminished it. If anything, they had clarified what it was for. Buddy shifted beside her. He pressed his nose briefly against her wrist, a small specific contact, and then settled again with his chin on the dockboard and his eyes half closed on the water. 2 months after the courthouse, the county prosecutor's office released an initial summary of the investigation into Willa Blaine and Whit Blaine. It was not a dramatic document. Legal proceedings rarely produce dramatic documents in their early stages. What it contained was an accounting, the total amount misappropriated from the Harbor House Fund across 22 months, the specific charges being pursued including fraud, misappropriation of charitable funds, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy, and the names of the additional parties under investigation, which included the individual whose name had appeared 3 times in Corbett's records as the creditor to whom Witt's gambling debts had been owed. Stanton Garfield was named separately in a parallel proceeding. The fabricated signature document had been traced, through forensic analysis of the paper stock and the printing method, to equipment in Crane's office. This did not prove that Crane had produced it. It proved that someone with access to his office had produced it. The distinction would matter at trial. It did not change what Letha knew about what had been attempted and why. She read the summary once at the kitchen table, with her coffee going cold beside her. Then she set it with the other documents in the folder Faye maintained for the legal proceedings, and she went back to work. She had made a decision, sometime in the weeks between the courthouse and the dock, about the nature of the outcome she wanted. Not for Willa, not for Whit. She had spent enough of herself on them. The outcome she wanted was the one Corbett had described in the notebook. Harbor House open, Harbor House operating, Harbor House being what it had been built to be. The investigation would proceed according to its own logic and timeline. The law would do what the law does with people who have misused it. Letha did not need to watch it happen. What she needed to do was what she was doing. In April, 3 new residents arrived within the same 2-week period, all through referrals from the church network that had become Harbor House's primary intake channel. A man of 64 named Willis, who had been sleeping in his car since losing his apartment to a rent increase that had doubled his monthly payment in a single cycle. A woman of 70 named Beatrice, who had been staying uncomfortably and on increasingly conditional terms, with a daughter whose own circumstances were precarious enough that the arrangement was failing both of them. A man of 58 named Ray, who turned out to be the same Birch Granger who had written to Corbett years earlier about the soup and the socks and the clean and pillow. Birch Granger arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, referred by a shelter 2 counties east that had connected with Faye's network. He was a compact man with a careful way of moving and a face that had processed a great deal of information quietly over many years. Letha did not know who he was when he arrived. She showed him the available room, the same routine she had developed with everyone. Here is the bed, here is the window, the bathroom is down the hall, dinner is at 6. There is no requirement to explain yourself before you eat. He was quiet through dinner. He helped Glennis clear the table without being asked, which was how Glennis assessed people, by what they did in the moment after the meal ended. She nodded once, her specific endorsement. It was Fenwick who recognized the name 2 days later, when Faye was reviewing the letters from Corbett's collection at the kitchen table. Fenwick had read all the letters in the collection at some point over the winter. He looked up from the chessboard and said, "Birch Granger, the Navy cook." Letha looked at Ray, who was sitting at the far end of the table reading a newspaper. She said, "Ray." He looked up. She said, "My father kept your letter." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the collection of letters on the table, at the familiar handwriting on the envelopes. Then he looked at the house around him, the repaired walls, the windows with their intact glass, the kitchen where the stove worked and dinner had been real food made in a real pot. He said, "I wrote that letter a long time ago. I didn't know if it reached him." She said, "It reached him. He kept it with the papers he trusted most." Birch Granger looked down at the newspaper in his hands. He smoothed a crease in it that did not require smoothing. Then he said, very quietly, "He was a good man. I never got to tell him that directly." Letha said, "He knew. Good men usually know." The investigation into Willa and Witt moved toward resolution over the following months in the way that serious legal proceedings move. Not quickly, not cleanly, with delays and continuances, and the procedural machinery of a system built for thoroughness rather than speed. What emerged, incrementally, was an accounting of what had been done and what it had cost. The money removed from the fund, the signatures falsified, the documents destroyed, the development agreement structured to ensure that the physical evidence of Corbett's work would be eliminated before anyone could examine it. The outcome when it arrived was not a single dramatic day in a courtroom. It was a series of documents, plea agreements, sentencing recommendations, civil judgments. Witt, facing the clearest evidence, entered an agreement that included restitution, supervised release, and a prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any organization managing charitable funds. Willa contested longer and lost more comprehensively. The civil judgment against the estate required the return of assets to the Harbor House Fund that substantially exceeded what had been taken, accounting for years of lost development. Stanton Garfield surrendered his law license in lieu of facing disbarment proceedings. He was 61 years old. He had been practicing for 33 years. The surrender was the kind of professional death that contains no dramatic final moment, but is permanent and complete. Faye received the final judgment documents on a Wednesday and drove to Harbor House that afternoon, rather than waiting for her scheduled visit. She sat across from Letha at the kitchen table and laid the pages out in the order that told the story most clearly, which was the order she always used. When Letha finished reading, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Through the kitchen window, she could see Hollis and Willis working on the boathouse, Willis handing tools with the deliberate attention of a man learning a vocabulary he had not previously had access to. Hollis was a patient teacher. He had discovered this about himself sometime in February and had not made a production of it. Faye said, "The restitution amount, combined with the grant and the existing resources, gives Harbor House a stable operational base for the foreseeable future. Your father's fund is now fully registered and fully funded. What he started is real." Letha looked at the documents on the table, at the columns of figures and the legal language and the official stamps. She said, "He started it with a notebook and a tube buried under the boathouse floor." Faye said, "He finished it with you." There is a specific quality to the light on Lake Ontario in late May, when the last of the winter has finally released its claim on the shoreline and the water reflects a sky that has remembered how to be generous. The lake takes on a color that is not quite blue and not quite gray, but something between, something that does not have a common name because it only exists at that latitude and that season and that particular angle of the afternoon light. Letha stood at the end of the dock on an evening in that light, 6 months after she had arrived at Blue Heron House, with $40 left in the world and a deed folded inside her coat. The dock boards were solid under her boots. Hollis had replaced 3 of them in March with lumber that Orville had selected personally, running his hand along the grain, the way Corbett had run his hand along the grain, feeling for what was worth keeping. Behind her, the house was full. Not crowded, not overwhelmed, but full in the way that things built for a purpose are full when the purpose is being served. 8 residents now. Fenwick and Glennis had stayed, had become, in their different ways, a kind of informal structure within the house. Fenwick with his woodpile and his chessboard and his quiet understanding of what the newer arrivals needed in the weeks after they arrived. Glennis with her folded blankets and her presence at the kitchen table in the early mornings when people were least offended and most in need of the specific comfort of a pot of coffee made by someone who had been expecting you. Hollis had become something like a foreman of the practical work, a role he had accepted without discussion and executed with the precision of his training, his younger residents helping him in the boathouse, learning from him the way people learn from someone who knows what he is doing without requiring them to explain why they need to know. The Hound was on the dock. He had followed Letha out, as he did most evenings now, and arranged himself on the boards with his chin on his paws and his enormous ears spread to either side, absorbing the last of the day's warmth from the wood. Buddy stood beside Letha. He was 8 years old. He had slowed since the winter, the way that honest old things slow, without apology and without drama, simply redistributing their energy toward what mattered most. He did not run anymore. He walked, and he walked everywhere that Letha walked, and when she stopped, he stopped, and when she was still, he was still, and his amber eyes in the late afternoon light were as clear and specific as they had been the day she found him in the farthest kennel of a shelter scheduled to close, when he had looked at her without urgency and she had understood. She put her hand on top of his head. He leaned into it slightly, the weight of him warm and real. The lake moved in its slow way, indifferent to human calendars, responsive only to wind and season and the deep internal rhythms of something that has been doing this for longer than memory. A blue heron stood at the edge of the shallows 30 yards to the north, absolutely still, holding its position with the patience of something that has learned to wait for exactly what it needs. Letha watched it for a long time. Corbett had named the house for that bird. Not the house he had inherited or purchased or built for himself, but the house he had planned to give away, the house he had hidden resources inside, and then placed in the hands of the one person he believed would understand what they were for. He had named it for a bird that stands at the edge of water and waits without impatience and takes only what it needs and lifts, when the time comes, with a grace that seems entirely at odds with the difficulty of getting airborne at all. She understood that now in a way she had not understood it the first winter. The name was not romantic, it was accurate. She had been that bird in the parking lot, in the truck, in the law office, when the senior partner read the will and the room went still in the particular way rooms go still when something inevitable has arrived. Standing at the edge of water that was too cold and too deep and not breaking, because breaking was not actually available as an option, because there were things that needed to happen that could only happen if she did not break. She had waited, she had lifted. Inside the house, through the kitchen window, she could see the light and the motion of people doing ordinary things in a space that had been made for them. Fenwick at the table. Glennis moving from the counter to the stove. Willis, who was learning to cook from Glennis with a student's focused attention. Birch Granger, who had taken to sitting in the sunroom in the late afternoon, not because it was a rule, but because the light there reminded him of something he did not describe and did not need to describe. Harbor House. The name Corbett had given it was the correct one, had always been the correct one, because what it described was not a building or a program or a charitable organization, in any of the ways those words suggest institutions and bureaucracies and the machinery of organized goodwill. It described a function. A harbor is a place where things that have been at sea come in, where the open water ends and the sheltered water begins, where the distance between the vessel and the shore is short enough to cross. Corbett had understood that the hardest part of being lost is not the being lost. The hardest part is the distance between where you are and the nearest place the door will open for you. He had spent the last decade of his life trying to reduce that distance for the specific people who had been asked to give the most and receive the least in return, and he had done it quietly, without recognition, without the machinery of official goodwill, with a notebook and a legal filing and a tube buried under a floor and a letter left for the one person who would know what to do with all of it. The heron lifted from the shallows. It rose without apparent effort, the wide wings catching the air with a sound like a page turning. It moved south along the shoreline, dropping lower as it went, and it was gone around the tree line and the shallows were empty again, holding only the reflected sky. Buddy watched it go. He tracked it until it disappeared and then looked back at the water. Letha looked at the house. She thought about what Corbett had written in his last letter. Do not let anyone convince you that it is a burden. She had carried it long enough now to know he was right. It was not a burden. It was the thing that had brought her here, kept her here, would keep her here for as long as here was where she was needed. She was needed here. That was not sentiment. It was information. She turned and walked back up the dock toward the house, Buddy on her left, the hound scrambling to his feet and following on her right, and the light from the windows of Harbor House fell across the dock boards in front of her, marking the way home. Inside, Fenwick looked up when she came through the door. He had the kind of face that does not perform emotions but shows them anyway, in small adjustments that require attention to read. He looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the chessboard, which was exactly enough. Glennis had made soup. Not because it was a special occasion, and not because anyone had asked, but because it was evening, and people were hungry, and she knew how to make soup, and the kitchen was hers to use for exactly that purpose. The smell of it had reached the front door before Letha opened it. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the cold at her back and the warmth in front of her. She came in, she closed the door. The hound went directly to the hearth and arranged himself in his permanent position, already asleep before his chin reached the floor. Buddy moved through the kitchen in his quiet circuit, checking each person in turn, and then returned to his post near the front door, which was where he slept, which was where he had always slept, because that was his work, and he had never needed to be asked to do it. Letha sat down at the table. Birch Granger came in from the sunroom and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter for a moment, looking out the window at the lake. He said, to no one in particular, or to everyone, which is sometimes the same thing, nice evening out there. No one disagreed. Hollis came in from the boathouse with sawdust on his jacket and sat at his usual place at the table and accepted the bowl Glennis placed in front of him with a nod that meant what it meant. Willis sat across from him, working through something in a notebook, frowning at it with the concentration of a man relearning the arithmetic of a life that had been disrupted. Beatrice was at the end of the table nearest the window. She had a habit in the evenings of looking at the lake. Letha had noticed it weeks ago and had not mentioned it because it did not require mention. There were things a person needed to look at, and the lake was one of them. The soup was served. The light inside the house held against the dark outside, as it had held every evening for months now, reliable as the structure that contained it, which had been made reliable by work and time and the accumulated effort of people who understood what was worth repairing. Letha looked at the table. She looked at the faces around it, the old ones and the newer ones, the ones who had been coming long enough to be comfortable, and the ones who were still learning what comfort felt like in a place where no one would ask them to leave. She thought about Corbett's notebook, about the men he had described, the man at the bus station, the man who called his daughter after a decade of silence, the man who wept over a folded blanket. She thought about how he had written their stories in the same register he used to document a renovation. Here is what needed doing, here is what was done, here is what came after. The same handwriting that drew load-bearing walls and calculated lumber lengths, applied to the task of recording what it looks like when a person is given enough to stand on. She had spent her life looking for a floor that would hold. She had spent years in the truck learning what it meant not to have one. She had come to Blue Heron House expecting nothing and found, in the wall beside the fireplace, the exact shape of what her father had always intended to build. And she had built it. Not finished it, because the work was not the kind that finishes. Every person who arrived would require something specific and real. Every week would produce its own problems and its own necessities. There would be harder months and easier months and months when the difference between staying open and not would be as thin as it had been In the first weeks before the bonds and the grant and the advocacy organization and the advocate with the scratched briefcase who had looked at Corbett's papers and said, "The bones are sound," but the floor held, the windows sealed, the door opened. Buddy raised his head from his position near the front door. His amber eyes moved to Letha across the length of the kitchen. He held her gaze for a moment in the specific way he had always held it, without urgency, without performance, with only the steady and particular attention of an animal that has located the thing it was looking for and settled, finally, beside it. She looked back at him. Outside, the lake continued its long work. The light from Harbor House reached across the water and held there, patient and warm, visible from the shore and visible further out. The kind of light that tells you where the harbor is when you are still too far away to see the shoreline clearly. The kind that stays on all night. The kind that does not go out